aware that people are still joining. That's fine. And thanks to anyone who's come back after previous sessions. That's encouraging. To quickly introduce us, if you haven't met us before, I am Mike Reed. I'm the founder and creative director here at Read Words. We also have Sam Russell on the line, who is one of our senior writers, and another senior writer, Orla Wood, who is going to be kind of hovering in the background and managing the chat. So quickly on how this is going to work. We've muted you and we had a very nice chat with some of you who've come off mute, but if everyone could go back on mute now, thanks guys. That'd be great, because we've got, as you can see, a lot of people joining, so keep the noise to a minimum. Because there are a lot of people, we can't do the kind of more interactive version of something like this, so we'll talk essentially around the subject for half an hour, and then, as I say, Orla will be watching the chat and collecting questions, comments, and so forth, and we can have 15 minutes at the end to talk through some of those. Some of you may not know that much about us, so really quickly, just an introduction to Read Words. We are a brand writing agency based in London, working all over the world. Nice to see, by the way, so many people from all sorts of corners of the world here. We aim to deliver the world's brightest words, and by brightest we mean both creative, colourful, vibrant, that sort of bright, but also bright as in clever, smart, words like that, because we see words as a strategic tool as much as a creative one. We are a team of 10 people, more or less, shifts around, based in London, as I say, mostly writers, but with also a dedicated client service team. So one of the rare things in being a proper copywriting agency. We work with all sorts of people on 4 buckets, if you like, of writing. We work on essentially every variety of brand writing, but we bucket it out like this. So brand voice, which is what we're going to talk about today. Also UX, a lot of specifically digital projects, working out user journeys and so forth, as well as the writing itself. Copywriting is our big bucket for kind of everything application focused, from websites to films, packaging, etc. And we also do a lot of naming work, as you can imagine, naming companies, startups and so forth, rebrands, but also products, services and so forth, both internally and externally. That work covers a whole range of clients, and this is a variety of our direct clients, so they range from the very big Tesco and F1, people like that, to the much smaller. We work with quite a few startups, you know, right down to the 1 or 2 person type company, and across all sorts of sectors, which I think is good for both us and our clients, that variety and interest. Just in terms of brand voice, it's worth showing you some of the brand voices specifically that we've worked on. I won't go through them all, obviously, but again, you can see there's a real variety there, again, from the big to small, across sectors, and hopefully that's a really good grounding of experience from which we can talk today. So let's get on with that. So building a brand voice, there's a lot to say about this, as I'm sure you'll be aware. A lot more that we can cover in 30 or 45 minutes, obviously, but we've tried to package up the most useful kind of nuggets under 3 titles. So we've got 3 principles, excuse me, to building a brand voice, which we've tied down as to be genuine. Oh, great, it's a good moment for my voice to go. Be genuine, bring everyone in, and make it usable, make it practical. So we'll kick off with that first one. And by be genuine, we mean, you know, essentially be who you are and find out who you are and act on that. So if we just go to the next slide. A lot of the time as writers, we hear people talk about sprinkle a bit of tone of voice over it, or can you give it a bit of tone of voice, as if tone of voice is this sort of fairy dust that you drop over your copy and make it wonderful. It's not that, if it's done properly. It's also not Apple's brand voice, or Nike's brand voice, or any other brand voice you might admire, and a lot of clients still fall into the trap of thinking, I want a bit of that, I want a bit of Apple, I want a bit of whoever, because obviously those brands are incredibly successful and have lots of good things going for them, so it's easy to think that, oh, if we sort of get a bit of that into our brand, it'll help us. We really don't think it's those things. What we think brand voice is not a kind of superficial thing, but deeply rooted in your brand and who you are and what you're all about, and also consistent. So consistent throughout the organization, and it has to be yours, has to be your own, has to come out of your brand, not be nicked from somebody else, because that stuff gets found out very quickly. So your voice is both what you say and how you say it. A lot of the time we talk about tone of voice, and we try not to do that so much at Read Words, because tone is one half of the story. It's not just the kind of character and style of your writing, it's also what you say, the messaging and content. Both of those things are vital. And to get that, you really need a clear sense, obviously, of who you are as a brand and what it is that you want to say, what is your offer, what are the things you want to put out there, and critically who you're talking to. Often this exercise can get a bit inward looking, and we start to think too much about just what we want to do or who we are, or that. We also obviously have to think about our audience and what they need to hear from us. And so to do that, you need really strong roots in a strategic foundation, if you like. So we need to know, what the brand is for, why it exists at all, what it stands for, what the personality is, and again, who are you talking to? We need to understand the audience. And as we said in the previous webinar, if you were there, writers can have a really useful role in all of these questions and helping you both to work out what these things are, but also to articulate those qualities and make them clear for everybody. Just a reminder to go on mute, so I can hear some noises in the background. Okay. If we go to the next one, sorry. Yeah, so how do we build a voice that is genuine, that is true to you, and all of those things we've talked about? Well, essentially, we want to get, obviously, that strategic grounding, but then we need to interpret that. And there's always many interpretations of a strategy, different ways that you could turn that strategy into a voice. So it's important to find the right version of that voice. So our approach is always to test a few approaches to see how many different directions we could take that brand and its personality in. So an example of that, we make up for these workshops, so we can't show you real examples, unfortunately, but say, for example, a new VR company called TrueSight came along wanting a voice, and we had all that strategic background, and then we wanted to turn that into a voice. So what we would tend to do is come at it from a few directions. So in this example, we've got 3 directions. There's a lot of copy on here. I won't try and go through it all. If you really want to read it, you can check our YouTube recording afterwards. But essentially, what we've done is take 3 different kind of angles on the same brand here, and we'll show clients actual copy. I think it's really important to get practical very quickly rather than talk in the abstract. So we'll show them real copy and say, you could be like this, you could be like that, and push it as far as we can in different directions. And inevitably what we'll find, of course, is that clients like, a certain aspect of number 1, a certain aspect of number 2s and 3s, and they'll want to kind of bring those together. That is fine. It's not a complaint. I think we would expect that. So what we will always do is try and synthesize all the bits that they feel are correct for them and feel right to them. And then we'll ask them, obviously, for the specifics. What is it about number 1 or number 3 that you really love? What are the phrases? What are the words? Not just, abstract qualities. And by doing that, we can bring all of the roots together, just slightly telescoping the process, obviously, but bring them together into a voice that combines all of those things. So in this example, again, I won't read it all out, but this kind of pulls together all 3 of those example voices into one coherent voice, and then we would start to unpack that in terms of guidelines and so forth. So that's a very quick version of how you sort of start to build a genuine voice that's true to your brand and useful. And then we're going to hand over to Sam for the second section. Over you go, Sam.
Great, thank you, Mike. So yes, so we've started to think about how we can find a voice that feels genuine and true and authentic to who we are as a brand. How can we make sure it's right for every part of our brand, and how can we make sure we bring everyone along on the journey? Well, the first thing to say is that your brand, whatever sector you're working in, runs on language. Language is an inevitable part of doing business and communicating. So it's not just the marketing, it's not just the advertising, it's not just the social, it's the HR, the job ads that you put out. It's customer service, it's how you email customers or deal with customer complaints. It's the letters your CEO writes to government or emails that he sends out to the entire business. Often brand voice projects fall down because they don't look at these things, and they kind of get stuck with the branding and marketing teams. But we really think for them to be successful, for them to be impactful, they need to reach as many different parts of an organization and a brand as possible. So it's not just the fun bit of your advertising, it's the words you use everywhere, because your audiences won't make that distinction between a job ad or a customer email or a social post. They'll just see it as all coming from the same brand. And if it sounds different and if it gives off a different impression of the brand, then that leads to an inconsistent idea of who the brand is and what they stand for. So to show you a few examples of this, this is a customer email from Ryanair, a low-cost airline here in the UK. And the voice here is full of energy and positivity and excitement. So it's using lots of puns, using lots of short, sharp, rhythmic sentences. The reason the voice is excited is because it's trying to sell us something, obviously. But then look at what happens when the brand suddenly has to do a very different job. For example, when it has to cancel a lot of flights and break bad news to hundreds of thousands of passengers. The voice here feels very different. It's suddenly cold, it's corporate, it feels very formal. You can understand why Ryanair are trying to write in this way, because they're slightly scared to break this bad news and they want to put the corporate walls up and kind of remove themselves from the situation as much as possible. But obviously for a customer, this is a terrible experience because you're used to being spoken to by Ryanair in one way in their promotional emails, and then suddenly the brand falls apart and you're spoken to in a very different way. Now, rewriting something like that is obviously pretty tricky. How do you bring it closer to a warmer, more human voice? That's a bit of a nightmare brief for a copywriter. But they certainly could have made, I think, much more of an effort. So here's our quick rewrite. We're sorry for the recent flight cancellations. To make sure it doesn't happen again, we're going to fly 25 fewer aircraft this winter. That means we can focus on making sure your upcoming flight isn't cancelled. It feels more human, it feels warmer, it feels like there's a group of people at Ryanair who really care about you and who are trying to fix this problem, unlike the previous version, which felt like a big kind of scary corporation that isn't really bothered about the situation. Now, Ryanair are perhaps a slightly soft target, but we think lots of brands, even the most famous brands, occasionally fall down on this. So this is an example of Nike. This is one of their posters, and we're all familiar with this voice. This is the kind of active, positive, slightly aggressive voice that Nike have been using for decades now. So this is the voice, but then so too is this the voice. This is a customer email from a couple of years ago, and this is telling someone that their trainers aren't going to arrive on time. There's a lot of copy on here, but we wanted to pull out a few examples. So we apologize for any inconvenience this has caused. That doesn't sound like Nike at all. That sounds a lot more formal and polite than we're used to hearing Nike talk to us. Likewise at the bottom, sincerely, Nike.com. Is there a more un-Nike word in the dictionary than sincerely? So what's happened here is that this has been written without thinking about the wider brand and without thinking about that voice that people know and respond to, which means that it feels like a really weird moment. And for the customer, you start to lose faith in who Nike are, and you start to question whether all the things that you imagine about them, all the kind of the coolness and the credibility, whether they're really genuine. So a voice shouldn't just stop at brand or marketing. It should be felt across an entire organization. Even things like terms and conditions, which are often seen as, the preserve of the legal team and not really something that brand voice should touch. We think even terms and conditions should be looked at through this lens. And if you're really committed to building a stronger voice, then they too should be brought into the process. So we spotted this blog from Revolut, which is a digital bank here in the UK. And they talked about how their voice is all about communicating clearly and in an easy to understand way. So then naturally they started to think about their terms and conditions, and they started to think about all the financial and legal jargon that are in terms and conditions. And that if they were really serious about being clear and easy to understand, then shouldn't their terms and conditions sound exactly like their advertising, their social and everything else. So it can be done. It's obviously very hard, it takes a lot of effort. But if you're committed to building a more consistent voice, then every aspect, every bit of language in a brand should be considered. How do you do that? Well, to involve as many different people from across the organization as possible. We don't mean practically in the workshops and helping build the voice. That would become a bit unwieldy, particularly if it's a very large organization. But you should be looking to have representatives from graduate recruitment, from HR, from customer services, from product, from as many different disciplines that are in your team as possible, because they will all use language and they will all have something useful to say about how the voice should be built. For some of those people, brand voice and the brand voice process might be a little bit new to them. So you probably have to do a little bit of explaining about why it matters and what it can do for the brand. But once you've got them bought into it and shown them the difference it can make to their day-to-day writing, then you can start to see that consistent voice kind of establish itself across an organization. One of the best ways to get people up to speed with it is obviously training. That's the moment when someone really gets to understand the voice and figure out exactly what it means for their writing. And then keeping a close eye on it. Voices are really tricky to manage, I think. And unless someone's keeping an eye on it, unless someone's kind of reviewing material that's going out, then they can often start to break apart and fall away, which means all the kind of investment you've made doesn't really lead to any impact. So that's how we can bring everyone in and bring lots of different parts of brand language into this process. For the final principle, we're going to look at making it usable, and I'm going to hand back to Mike for that.
Great, thank you, Sam. So yeah, this is really key. It's very important that you don't just get to that point of having a nice PDF set of guidelines and stop. That often is the kind of the line drawn under a voice program, is when you've got those guidelines. But of course, it's very easy then for it just to become a tick in a box and a file somewhere, and not an active living thing. So it should be a lot more than that. It should be an integral part of how the whole organization is communicating, both internally and externally. Otherwise, as we've just seen, it starts to break down rather quickly. It's very easy to sort of talk about these things and have conversations around what we'd like the voice to be. It's much harder to actually make it real and deliver it consistently. But obviously it can be done. People do it very well. One of the problems is that we tend to talk, certainly in the initial stages, in these very big, broad principles. So we will hear a lot of clients, or even you might read in guidelines sentences like this, these sorts of words: bold, human, and engaging, all kind of probably valid words, but what do they actually mean? And obviously, again, there's a lot of interpretations around that. The word human comes up all the time, and when we say human, what do we mean? Do we mean, again, sort of Nike human, this very kind of big, dramatic, emotive language? Or do we mean human like HSBC, a rather cooler, more kind of cerebral humanity, talking about, in this case, renewable energy and so forth? Or do we mean human like Oatly, fun and cheeky and a bit kind of elbow in the ribsy? All of those are human, but of course, they don't tell us what sort of human we mean. And inevitably, people will say, oh, that's fine. That kind of, I sort of get that. But what does it really mean? And how do I write like that? How can I actually put this into action? And we think it's really important to get, again, practical and specific as early as possible. So, we need to think about all of these really specific things around the language that we're using to make that voice work. Should it be short sentences or long flowy ones? Should it be really straightforward and direct, or should it be more elusive and even poetic? Should it be funny, etc., etc.? And obviously things like digital communication have brought in all sorts of new questions like emojis and sets of acronyms or whatever. So how do you use all those things? What's right, what's wrong? You need to think about those specifics and give people those tools to make the voice work. We think it's important to see, in that sense, the voice guidelines not just as a kind of big strategic document about, we are this, we are that, we are the other, but they're much more, if you like a recipe book. There's something that you can use to do it yourself, essentially. You can take those recipes and they give you the confidence and the tools to then interpret the voice in your own way. And like any recipe, they need to be easy to follow. They need to be practical. If you just talk in big, either too broad terms or very technical terms that are difficult to understand, neither of those things is going to be helpful. So you need to think about all the different people who are going to be reading these guidelines and what they need in order to put them into action. People get this very right and very wrong. It's been really interesting to look at Uber's new guidelines, which are all online. You can find them. There's a whole lot about their voice on there. And there's some perfectly kind of valid big principle stuff. considerate, simple and direct, consistent, all good things for a voice to be. So that kind of kicks you off. But in terms of practical tools, it all starts to get a bit confusing. They have principles or tools like this: confirm all homonyms and homophones, hyphenate modifiers. A lot of people will be asking questions like this, perfectly valid question, and getting immediately confused about, okay, this feels really complicated. This feels like something I don't even understand the terms being used. I don't know how to do this. And of course, either they'll get it wrong or they just won't do it at all. More likely, they'll just fall back on the old habits. So you have to make sure it's much more practical. A better example, and I know it comes up all the time, but it is such a good example, is Monzo's tone of voice. Again, it's all online, so you can look it up and have a proper read, but they do the same job, but much better, I think. They turn those big principles, use the language our audience uses, we're ambitious and positive, words like that, big, broad words that need interpretation, and then they follow them up with really clear, specific, practical advice. So in this case, they're talking about using normal words rather than formal ones, and they've given us a list there. So you've got immediately really useful, specific stuff, and I think readers will feel much more empowered, to use that slightly cliche word, to get on and use the voice. They'll feel they've got what they need. And remember that your guidelines are not just for copywriters like us. It'll be, again, used by everyone, might be used by customer service teams who've never come across this stuff before. We've been in that position of training that kind of team. Or in terms of, we worked for a theatre and they needed their box office staff to understand this stuff. So remember the breadth of your audience and what they're going to need. And of course, even seasoned writers, even professional copywriters need real clear brief, real clear instructions on how they make that voice work. Otherwise, they're going to go off in the wrong direction. So broad principles, yes, absolutely. We want to set the scene and get the kind of everyone in broadly the right place, but then you need a lot of practical tools and critically examples to bring it to life. And we think examples are really key. Just to run you through a live example of this, this is a set of guidelines, or part of them, that we wrote for Sea Life. You probably know them, the aquarium people. We worked with them a couple of years ago, and these are some sample pages from our guidelines for them. So again, broad principles. We set up the voice. We did something that we often do, which give it a kind of a single phrase that sums up the whole thing. Sometimes that might be a persona or whatever, but in this case, dive in summed up the kind of enthusiasm and energy we wanted in the voice. And then we've got a little introduction there talking about the voice needing to be energetic, enthusiastic, excited, words like that. So it sets up that broad picture of what we want the voice to be. And then we get into, very quickly, into the practicalities. So, you know, what does dive in sound like? What does it mean? So here we have a set of really practical tools. So starting at the top there, weird is wonderful. Say it out loud. Our creatures are weird, wonderful, sometimes gross. We discovered, talking to them, that a lot of people in aquariums, kids especially, obviously, love how weird sea creatures are. And they're all pretty peculiar, and sometimes they're a bit yucky, and kids love all that, so make the most of it. We talked about using interjections, so actually dropping in words like yuck or ouch and exclamation marks and things like that. Using you and we, that's a pretty well established principle generally, but really important to remember and have in there, etc., etc. You can see really practical tips there. And then we move from that into examples, lots of examples, as many as I can, really. You'll find most people turn straight to the examples, and when they're looking at guidelines, they want to see it living, they want to see how it actually sounds. There's obviously a lot more than this, but here's just one example. So previously, Sea Life's Atlantic Ocean introduction poster was a very short thing saying that the Atlantic takes up a lot of the Earth's surface. We kind of all know that. So what we've done is do a version that has that tone we've just talked about, starts with also has a more interesting fact in there that the Atlantic is the world's saltiest ocean, uses words like gross or whatever, and then also has a sense of excitement. Get ready to say hi, invites the readers in. So enacts all of the principles that we've been setting up. a really important thing we do as well with examples is not just to show before and after, but to talk about what's changed. So here we've got 3 particular points that we wanted to pull out. You know, the fact that it's fun, we found facts that are interesting and enjoyable, gives people a reason to care, and it gets people excited. And we've talked about how the language does that. So a big set of examples like this with clear notes as to what we've done are really helpful for all of those different audiences to start using the brand properly. As we said, the PDF, the whatever, the even printed guidelines you still see sometimes are not the end. And we think training is really important. We started doing training a few years ago, and it's become absolutely critical to the voice programs that we run. It's just important to get people in a room and give them the chance to try it out in a kind of safe environment. You know, they can get it wrong, they can find out, they can ask their questions, and it means that they get confident with the voice. They're not scared of using it. They're not scared of all these terms like active voice or whatever. They feel they can get going with the voice. So that's a really important thing. And as Sam said earlier, it's also not a kind of fixed process. This, you have to keep it under review. Big or small organizations, they're all going along over time, and it's very easy for a voice to kind of start to drift or even to break. You know, you might find in one department or, you know, one area like social or whatever, things have kind of gone a bit wrong for whatever reason. If you keep it under review, then you can kind of pull it back. And of course, there are other things like, you know, new joiners coming in that you need to keep up to date. So that's a very quick whistle-stop tour through brand voice. Quickly to sum that up, we have those 3 principles of be genuine. You know, don't see it as a superficial thing. See it as a really deeply rooted expression of who you are, what you're all about, and that should be rooted in the strategy. It should be the whole organization, so bring everyone in, going beyond marketing and making sure everyone gets it and can use it. And to that end, make your guidelines really practical and useful and specific. Specific is the word I'd want anyone to walk away with, really. And then, as I say, review it, keep training, keep reviewing, make it part of the induction process, and you'll start to build a really robust, consistent voice. That was super fast, obviously, so we can now start to think about questions that you guys have got. And I know you've been feeding them into the chat, so Orla, do you have anything juicy for us to get our teeth into?
Yes, I do. Thank you, Mike. We have a question that relates to what we were just talking about on training, which you've covered a bit on, but I wondered if you wanted to expand a bit and tell us a bit more about how we approach training a whole organization and how we can tailor training to maybe customer service teams, sales teams, things like that, how we can roll it out across everyone.
Sam, I might let you.
Sure, that's a great question. So sometimes the organizations we work with are very small and a handful of writers, but then of course we sometimes work with organizations where it's hundreds of people, and some of those people will be day-to-day sort of professional writers. Some of those people won't consider themselves like that and won't really think about their writing. So finding a model for training that works for both sorts of those people is tricky. We often start by gathering together the key writers, I suppose. So, you know, running workshops of 10 to 12 people, drawing from across, say, marketing or customer services, the people that write day to day and who need this stuff as soon as possible and really need to kind of take it on board more than anyone else. They then often become the advocates for the voice. So they then, you know, take on responsibility for managing it, for making sure that it's part of the organization. And then we look at everyone else and whether that's running shorter sessions, so not a 3-hour intensive workshop, but maybe an hour, maybe running something online or selling people a kind of online course. It's important, I think, to understand that for some people, this is a really tricky thing. And if you're, say, a law firm and you're used to writing in a very formal kind of legal way, if a group of people come in and say, we'd like you to change the way you write, that's often really tricky. And people have to unpick a lot of the things that they've learned and a lot of the things that they've got used to over X number of years. So yes, I think it's about tailoring it, about starting off with those key writers and making sure they're up to speed with it so that they can start kind of promoting the voice, and then looking at the other teams and seeing what they need. And so if it's a customer services team, it's thinking about the specific examples and exercises they can run out. If there's a particular problem, say responding to complaints, let's make that part of the workshop. So it's not just getting everyone to rewrite tweets or to become very comfortable in writing for social channels, but really comfortable for the channels that they work in.
Can't add much to that.
Great. We've had another question about working for multinational brands and how we approach a client that would need their voice to work across different countries and different languages.
Yeah, that's another big one. So we've done this happily. Again, it's kind of, it sounds obvious, but it's a case of listening to what those different teams need. So I'm just thinking, we did a job with a big American firm a while back that also had teams in the UK. So we did workshops on both sides, and they were tailored to obviously the particular the sorts of people that will be in those teams, whether they're customer service or product or what have you, and also their audiences and what they need to talk about, and how you make the sort of the main voice work in those contexts. So there's a lot of listening as well as a lot of talking, you know, just understanding how specific the needs are. In terms of languages, actual other languages, that's something we haven't done training in, I have to say. We do quite a bit of work that gets translated by translation partners we have, but Sam, unless I'm wrong, we haven't done actual training in foreign language versions of a tone of voice.
No, not per se, but with Sea Life, actually, they operate in lots of different markets, so have work in lots of different languages. So we created the English guidelines, which were kind of the first guidelines. And then we worked with a team of writers around the world who were comfortable in English and obviously their native language to figure out what exactly does this voice, how does this voice translate into Mandarin or German? And sometimes you come across some pretty thorny issues where a German copywriter might tell you, well, we just don't do that in German. That sounds very weird. So it's about working with them to interpret the spirit and the personality of the voice and finding a way of bringing that to life in German. And that's where you rely on an excellent kind of translator to help you with that. And then, yeah, we've run workshops in English, and then they have been run subsequently in the foreign language. So yeah, it can be done. It's actually trickier than if you're just working with a brand that only works in English. But yes, it can definitely be done.
We have another question about who should own a brand voice within an organization. If you notice that the voice is drifting or breaking, who should the responsibility to correct the course lie with within an organization?
That's true. For me, I think the risk is that it naturally falls to the head of marketing or head of brand, and sometimes they're the right person. But I think it's better if you create a structure where lots of different people are involved. So we've worked on projects in the past where the organization has created a kind of a team of guardians from across brand and HR and all the different components of the organization, and then they get together on a bi-monthly basis, whatever it might be, and so they're all looking at the voice and all coming at it from slightly different angles. I think if it just becomes the responsibility of one team, then that team can become ignored and it can start to feel like it just belongs to them rather than something that the entire organization needs to think about.
It's always interesting to discover who the writers are in an organization. Often they come from places you don't expect. And if you are in a big organization, you call out for people who are naturally interested and talented in this particular work can mean that you kind of discover writing stars in all sorts of funny little nooks and crannies of the company, and they can become part of that team and defend and review the voice over time. So that's quite a useful thing to do.
And you, to that point, you might also discover that although you might think that it's the advertising or the website that people are looking to, that actually it's the customer emails that our audiences get really annoyed by or slightly confused by, so that's where we should focus our attention on for the moment and get those working and get those in the same voice. So yeah, I think it's useful to have as many conversations as possible because you often discover really interesting things about the way language is managed across a brand.
We had another question about finding balance with a tone of voice. If you say the client is coming from maybe a professional services or a financial services side, but they still want to have a sort of human, maybe even a slightly playful tone of voice? Is it possible to get this right and still have the trust and have that level of professionalism within a voice?
Well, the short answer is definitely yes, because we've done it. I like to think successfully a few times now. So I'm just thinking, quite recently we worked with a big international law firm called Simmons and Simmons, worked with Someone Design on that. And it was very much, that was the brief. It was, we understand that we're lawyers, we're in a professional services, there's a lot of trust and authority that is invested in this brand that we need to retain, but also they were conscious that there wasn't a lot of what was actually a really genuine personality within the organization that wasn't coming through in their voice, and they were very conscious of that. Importantly, they were conscious of that from the very top, from the managing partners down, if you like. So that was really key to making sure the voice actually happened and happened in the right way. So a lot of the conversations with those guys was about exactly that balance, getting some more humanity, an element of informality into the voice, an element of conversational quality, without, as you say, kind of losing the sense of authority and trust and intelligence and all those things that you would want to see in a law firm. And the transformation in terms of from where they were to where they are was pretty dramatic. I think if you go on the site now and read it, it feels quite natural. I don't think you'd look at it and go, this is a really dramatic tone of voice, really something amazing. But it took them a lot further, and they now have a much friendlier, much more kind of engaging voice rather than simply presenting information, which is what I think they would agree they were doing before in a rather functional way. So it absolutely can be done, and obviously there are particular needs and guardrails, if you like, within an organization like that you just need to be really conscious of. Again, it's about listening as much as anything.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that word playful often comes up at the start of a brand voice project, because I think sometimes people feel like they look at a voice like Skittles or innocent smoothies. And I think that's what voice sounds like. And does this mean that we need to copy them? I think if you're not a playful organization, then your voice shouldn't sound playful. If you are, great. And that's something that we can kind of tease out and kind of express more vividly. But if you're a very direct, simple, easy to work with organization, then your voice should be all those sorts of things. So yes, I think it's about doing that strategic part of the start and figuring out who exactly are we and how do we express that in language rather than kind of grafting on something that doesn't quite feel right for us.
Something we've talked about, I know, is the idea of having a sort of two different sets of tone of voice guidelines, one as a sort of basic version for everyone in an organization and another that's maybe more aimed at the marketing or brand teams. And we've had a question on this about whether we sort of find ourselves giving similar advice because we're just trying to improve writing, undo some of the common ills of sort of sounding like a corporate robot. And how do we balance that with giving our clients something that's actually distinctive and that will stand out as a voice?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. Very apt, because almost every set of voice guidelines has quite a lot in it that is essentially good writing guidelines, as much as specific to the brand. And that's kind of inevitable, I guess, because we all have lots of bad habits, basically, especially those of us who aren't necessarily trained or experienced as writers. So there's always a certain amount of getting everyone up to a kind of good level of writing in a general sense. But then obviously the really important stuff in terms of the brand has to be there as well, and has to be kind of layered on top of that, if you like. You can't leap from a kind of relative lack of knowledge about writing to being a brand copywriter. And you need to have those basic tools as well. So there'll always be that, I think, combination of guidelines, if that's at all possible. But that doesn't invalidate them, I don't think. As long as the brand layer, if you like, is sufficiently considered and rooted and all the things we've talked about, then the great thing is that you get both. You raise the general standard of communication, but also everything ends up feeling like that brand as well. So it's doing a dual job, certainly.
Okay, let's see what else we've got then. Someone is asking about how we help clients distinguish between the different elements of their brand, so their values, their personality, and their tone of voice. Do we think that these should be distinct, or should they all be connected in some way?
That's a really interesting question. I think for me, and having run quite a few training workshops where you sort of stand up and present, okay, here's our personality, here are our values, here's our essence, here's our voice. You can sort of see people, particularly if they're not marketers or people that work in communications or branding, slightly glaze over because they think, I'm being introduced to a lot of different elements here, and how do they work? I mean, I think for voice, keeping it as grounded as possible in language is really important. So if it starts to feel like just another series of values, so if your values are bold, ambitious, and enthusiastic, and then your voice has a similar set of values, then that's not, I don't think, terribly useful for anyone. But if your voice is really clear and specific about language, I think that's when you can start to bring people along and kind of make them understand the value of voice. So yeah, I don't think it's, for me, kind of creating another set of words that kind of sit on a slide that people get confused about how they all fit together, but making sure that the voice is really specifically about, this is about language, this is about the way we talk and the way we write.
Yeah, we do try very hard not to create more and more, sets of words, as Sam says. Brand is almost inevitably full of those, as you say, personality, values, all of which are valuable without a doubt, but keeping them simple and practical as much as possible is really key to making it actually happen. Otherwise, yeah, as Sam says, you just sort of look at it and glaze over a bit because you think, I can't balance all of these things in one go and write this email that I've got to write.
All right, great. I think we'll finish up then with a fun one from Laura, who's pointed out that we often pick on Ryanair as an example. A very good tone of voice, and she asks if we would like to work on that brand.
Absolutely. This entire webinar series has been designed to win the Ryanair business. We pick on that example because it's one of the clearest we've found of the lack of consistency and what a weird experience that is for an audience. Obviously, there are lots of brands that make the same mistakes. We don't want to make it seem like Ryanair are the only people doing it, but it is quite a useful illustration.
Yes. Sorry, Ryanair.
Yes.
But the Nike example again shows, as we said, even the biggest, best managed brands can forget whole areas of work. So that's why you need that central management point, I think, looking after everything. And that applies to Nike as much as Ryanair and everybody else.
And I think just one final point on that before we finish. I think the reason why Monzo, I think, are able to do this is because they're only a few years old. They hired writers early on, so they've built a culture of language and the importance of language. It's really tricky if you're a 100-year-old bank and you're trying to unpick the way you've been writing for 100 years. So it's much harder, I think, if you're a kind of legacy brand with lots of things to think about. So yeah, choosing startups is maybe slightly easy, but it is possible. I think it just takes a bit more effort and a bit more investment from a kind of older, more established brand.
Yeah, and I do think Simmons & Simmons, again, is a good example of that. And as I say, because it came from the top or involved the top, that's what made it work. And it's really important to have that buy-in all the way through the organization, I think. Okay, we're like a minute off, aren't we? So once again, say thank you to everybody for coming along to this one and all the others. We're calling this the end of season 1. We've now done the 4 that we initially planned. Just quickly, we're going to do this one again. We've had so much interest, we're actually going to do it again next week. Sam will remember exactly when, because I can't. But we're doing it also at a time that's more conducive for our American contacts and friends. So it's going to be at 5 p.m. on
Thursday. So that's noon Eastern time, and then I think 9 Pacific.
So yes, you can come and watch it all again, or you can tell other people to come and see it then. We're also going to do a season 2, and so we'd really love to know what you guys and others would want to see in future webinars. So we always send out a little survey, and we'd love for your responses on that anyway. But also, if you have something burning that you'd love us to talk about in one of these, please do let us know. We want to respond to what you guys want as much as what we want to talk about. And all our details are here and on the next day. you go. That's all our details, so you can look us up. And this will be on our YouTube channel shortly, and we're also writing blog posts about each of these, so picking up on the key points in written form on our blog. Watch out for that as well. Have I missed anything, guys?
No, I think that's everything.
Great. All right. Thanks so much for coming, everyone, and maybe see you again.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Cheerio.